I think that the jet stream is about to go on a pretty far to the north retreat and stay there. And my reasoning for that is it.
Hi, once again, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And again, I'll remind you to like these videos, subscribe to them, and also share these videos with someone who can utilize the information because it's pretty important, especially this time of year. I'm happy to introduce my guest for the day, Eric Snodgrass. He is with Nutrien Ag Solutions, and he is a senior science fellow. My goodness, that sounds like a stuffy title, but congratulations on the title, and thanks for joining us here, Eric. I've always wanted to talk to you for a long time. We both have kind of a common interest when it comes to agricultural weather and weather outlooks. This is the time of year where that is front and center, isn't it? I mean, everybody wants to know what the weather is going to do, especially after the 4th of July holiday. We have some very critical times coming up, don't we, in the crops?
Yeah, this is a pretty important time period. And what's interesting about this year is that for some of the Northwest Corn Belt, the timing of pollination is a bit later, right? We had so much wet weather in the Northwest Corn Belt early, some replanted crop that instead of being right after the 4th of July, now it's like the 4th of July to the 4th of August. That's going to be most critical, I think, for pollination for corn especially. And so, yeah, this is that time of year where people hang on the words that we meteorologists say.
Well, we had this weird event that came in. It just came crashing out of the southern, equatorial Atlantic and then through the Caribbean and through the Gulf of Mexico. It's called Beryl. It was a record setter. I mean, it became the first or the earliest Category 5 hurricane we had seen. It went through the Yucatan Peninsula, made landfall in Texas, and now it's drawing a beeline right for the Ohio Valley. And this is going to be interesting because from what I had heard, Eric, I thought that was probably some of the driest part of the Corn Belt. And I would imagine they're probably in line to get quite a bit of moisture out of this.
Yeah, one of the reasons why Beryl was able to achieve Cat 5 status was because the Atlantic Ocean right now is as warm as it typically is in September. So you had the ingredients for rapid intensification, and it hit Trinidad Tobago, then it went over or just to the south of Jamaica, hit the Yucatan Peninsula. In fact, one of the kind of not so discussed things about Beryl is that it actually helped ameliorate drought issues in Mexico as well. But the main moisture kind of pushed farther to the north into Texas. It dropped 6 to 10 inches of rain throughout Texas. And actually, it hit eastern Texas, which was already having its wettest year on record. In fact, most of eastern Texas through May had already had an entire year's worth of rainfall. So this is just adding on to that. It hit the coast with wind speeds around 80 to 100 miles an hour. And right now it's going through Arkansas and Missouri and is going to end up in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and it'll finish in Ontario and Quebec. So that's pretty far north into a drier spot of the Corn Belt. Because if you just think about this year on the whole, the Eastern Corn Belt's been drier. The Western Corn Belt's been exceptionally wet. And this is kind of coming through, avoiding the Western Corn Belt, hitting the Eastern Corn Belt with some perfectly timed rains. In fact, I'm watching outside my window right now, the rain from Beryl. And I'll be honest, I couldn't be more excited because I'm here in Eastern Illinois and we could use this rain.
Well, and the markets, on Monday, they seem to reflect that they just really got deflated. Kind of a side note, while we're talking about Beryl, as it was coming out of the Caribbean, heading toward the Yucatan, that didn't happen to throw any moisture off to help the Panama Canal, did it? Because that lake is so dry down there.
Yeah, it turns out that over the last couple of months, which is now into the wet season for that region of Central America, the main lake in the middle of the Panama Canal, I think they call it the Gatun Lake or Lake Gatun, it's actually recovered to near normal levels. So we've already seen the moisture level come back up in the area, reflected in the lake. Of course, that is a man-made lake there that was created for the canal purposes. So all of the discussion we had a year ago about the major drop in that lake level, the inefficiency of the canal, I think we're done with that in the near term. But it's interesting you bring that up. Over the last 6 months, we saw major supply routes, global shipping routes change to avoid the Panama Canal and to also avoid the Suez Canal. And so it has become more economically efficient for some, not all, but for some to go around the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn, that would be South America and South Africa, to avoid some of the traffic delays on these huge canals that run right in the middle of big continents, right? So Yes, but the lake level, just checked it the other day, is back up to normal levels. In fact, my parents are going to go on a cruise down there in February. I said, take pictures so that I can see, how things look once we get toward that winter time frame. But yeah, I think the lake's recovered.
So, in essence, I mean, looking at the domino effect, then that should be helping our freight rates quite a bit coming out of the Gulf.
Yeah, it could, but we might have other issues with global shipping, and some of those have a lot to deal with one, how active we expect the hurricane season to be later, and two, there's a lot of flooding on the main tributaries to the Mississippi right now, and so that all gets kind of factored into some of the costs of these things, and so yeah, you would hope for a positive note on this, but I still think there's other global pressures that are pushing things around.
I know last winter I was doing interviews about the Mississippi River, and there wasn't enough water to properly float a boat, as you would say. And now I don't think that's probably an issue. Are they worried about flooding after Beryl goes through?
They are, but mainly because of what happened before Beryl. Just the fact that May, June, and the beginning of July is record wet on some of the main tributaries on the western side of the Mississippi, and then the Mississippi River itself have really brought water levels up. So I was just looking the other day at some of the flood gauges. If you just follow the western edge of Illinois, between that Missouri, that in Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all of those tributaries on the western side are in flood stage. Now, on the eastern side, the Ohio River Valley, it will take on the moisture from Beryl and be happy to do so. So therefore, what's interesting is if you look where it all comes together down in Memphis, right south of, where Illinois, right there at the southern tip of Illinois, get to Memphis, the river is at kind of normal levels. It's not yet flooded because one side's so wet, one side's so dry, that evens out right there in the middle. But I think there's certainly something to be said for the fact that 2 falls in a row, we've watched that river drop down to up to 12 feet below low stage at Memphis, severely limiting traffic into the fall and winter months.
So, from your experience, so far this growing season, which of the weather models do you think is actually proving to be more accurate?
Love the question. It's a hard one. I actually compare 6 different models and their ensembles. All right. So you want to know what it's like to wake up and be me. It's like, all right, let's pick and choose and try to see which one has the best skill score and all that kind of stuff. With Beryl, the model we run in the United States called the GFS, it got it right. I mean, and usually we don't rely on the GFS model to be good with hurricanes. We typically look at the European model, but it was the latecomer. It missed it. It pushed the moisture into Mexico, not into Texas, really. Now, it corrected once the hurricane got south of Jamaica, but early on, boy, the ECMWF pushed it all into Mexico. Now, what's exciting about the field of atmospheric sciences is that the newest model we have to use is this one that just came out of the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, the ECMWF as we call it. But they're not only running their normal model, but they have another one that's all based on artificial intelligence. So it's really machine learning based that's been enabled with the new revolution in AI. And that model, you could say that Hurricane Beryl was its first real test in the tropical season. And I don't want to say it was a swing and a miss, but it was maybe a bit of a foul tip, right? So it missed the first, but got it a bit later. I think a lot of us were hoping that this new artificial intelligence forecasting system would be able to find things sooner, and it didn't. So the good old GFS won the most recent battle with trying to pick up on this hurricane. But if you want to know what I do every day, I actually show all of them. I'm like, you know what? Let's look at everything in comparison. And I find that people, when they do that, can draw better conclusions about what the most likely situation could be.
Do you like to average them out?
You got to be careful when averaging them out because sometimes taking the average washes out the signal, right? So when you blend them all together, you may miss the most defining thing about a system. So what I instead do is a comparison rather than an averaging.
All right. So everybody wants to know, is this still, is this a relic of changing over to La Niña? Are we still under an El Nino regime? Where are we right now? Last I heard, we were kind of in the middle.
We are in the middle. And I think that's really important question for you to ask. And what I want to say is that sometimes in summer, there is major over attribution to either El Nino or La Nina on the weather pattern. But you have to remember this, when it comes to El Nino and La Nina, their greatest influences are during the cold season. So late fall, winter, and early spring. In summer, Because what El Nino typically affects and what La Nina typically affects is the jet stream behavior. Well, in summer, the jet stream is naturally weaker and farther to the north, which means it's of lower influence. So my point in telling you that is that right now we've moved into ENSO neutral conditions, and therefore the bigger player with the weather conditions is really the heat that's in the North Pacific and the heat that's in the North Atlantic influencing the flow of the jet stream pattern. And it's been that way for months. Now, will we be talking about La Nina late this summer into fall? You bet. It's going to become a major factor once we get into fall and winter. But this particular summer, it's kind of playing second fiddle. In fact, I would just say it's that band kid that decides not to play his instrument. He's just hanging out, waiting to get involved and not really contributing much right now. But later it will be a bigger influence.
Okay, so I'm going to go a little further out there,
Yeah,
and you probably don't get this question too much, but how does it all coincide with sunspot activity? That's an
sure.
11-year cycle. And now we have the El Nino La Nina cycle. Some talk about the Northern Atlantic cycle. What is that, a 22-year cycle or something like that? Are they converging? Are they on opposite wavelengths right now? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so if we pick apart any individual piece, right? So El Nino, La Nina, what's going on in the Atlantic or the Pacific, or what's going on in the upper atmosphere or the solar cycle, you'll often find that any individual piece has very low correlation with your weather. Maybe the correlation coefficients are, especially with sunspots, at best, they're like zero point 0.1 to minus zero point 0.1, which means they're not the dominant factor. And that's good because if the sunspot cycle was a dominant control on the weather patterns, we would see our weather patterns reflecting the 11-year cycle, or we'd be able to see them reflecting. There's actually a 22-year cycle that goes over that, and an even bigger, almost century-long cycle to the sunspots. The reality is that sunspot cycles, from a peak to a valley, the total energy output from the sun still only varies a small amount. My point behind telling you that is it's often these smaller subseasonal effects that tend to dominate our weather patterns, which means even if you have a historical correlation with where we are in the sunspots and you say, all right, we should be warmer than average. One small shift in the North Pacific or North Atlantic, or a change in this thing called the MJO, or a change in sea ice concentration, it can outdo that pretty quickly. So I'll just be honest with you. I have spent a lifetime, it feels like, trying to research what the main factors are that control the seasonal outlooks. In other words, can we predict this fall, this winter, next spring? And the reality of it is that the more I spend time trying to gain, wisdom in doing this, the more I find that it's very, very difficult task to have statistical accuracy and skill in doing. So where do we sit with all of it? We're transitory between all of those different variables right now. And that's why prediction has been quite difficult this year. They're not all constructively adding up or deconstructively working against one another. And that's what makes it challenging. So the answer to your question is, I don't know.
Well, I love the
Yeah,
honesty. I appreciate that.
yeah, yeah,
Some years the jet stream has more of a zonal flow. Some years they
yeah.
have really high amplitude waves in the jet stream. How would you classify it this year?
Yeah, so this year for most of spring into summer, I saw a lot of momentum zonally from Japan into the West Coast United States and right along the US-Canada border. And if you haven't talked to anybody in the Canadian Prairie right now, most of their spring was cold and wet. I just spent 2 weeks in northern Wisconsin. We only had 2 days where the temperatures approached average. Most of it was cool and wet. The Pacific Northwest, other than this last week, has been cool and at times been wet, which means that's where the jet stream has lived. So where's all the heat been? Southern California, the desert Southwest, the southern plains, and the Southeast. So it's this major split where there's been so much colder weather to the north and cooler weather to the north and warm weather to the south, and the jet has run zonally between the two. Now, in midsummer, it's going to lose that. At some point, it's going to start getting a bit more wobbly. The Bermuda high is going to take over. The Pacific high is going to take over. The pattern's going to stagnate. And We also call that fall, right? So we get into a stagnant pattern in fall every year anyway. So this is one of those setups where most of this spring and early summer has had zonal flow, but at some point it's going to become more meridional, north, south, and block up somewhere. We think right now that's going to be over the Four Corners states, not necessarily over the Corn Belt.
Some folks say that we've already been under the influence of a Bermuda high, basically anchored over Atlanta this year.
Yeah, we have. And to be honest, the people that are most happy about that right now as we're speaking are in Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, and the Mid-Atlantic, because the Bermuda High is inching its way toward the East Coast. Flow is going around the southern side of it, and it's going to start to just dump better chances of rain into that region. And if you look back over the last, 45 days, we've seen drought expand in the Mid-Atlantic, in the southeast. In fact, there's been a 3-class degradation in drought in some areas, and they couldn't be happier that we're going to be pumping in Atlantic moisture around the Bermuda High into that area. But remember, a year ago, the Bermuda High split. Part of it went to Europe, part of it went to the Hudson Bay, and that was when last spring got really, really, really dry for the Great Lakes and the Midwest. This year, the Bermuda High is closer to its normal spot, and it's stronger, which is why the moisture keeps pumping around the southern side of that. And the good news about that is we're not closing off the Gulf of Mexico. The worst thing that can happen in July and August is if all of a sudden you shut off the Gulf of Mexico, no flow out of the south, you get no storms, and drought sets in fast. So your question about the Bermuda High being where it is, that's a very, very good thing overall.
That kind of leads to that ring of fire around it. Of course, a high pressure system always rotates clockwise, and that brings
Right.
it all in over, Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, and right where it has been really wet. Do you see that shifting anytime in the next 2 or 3 weeks or not?
I do. I actually see a little bit of a more benign weather pattern for the next few weeks after we get rid of Beryl. In other words, we're going to get to this time period starting, this weekend, where the jet stream is going to really go north. The Bermuda High staying just enough offshore not to be a major, major factor. And the pattern's going to stagnate, and all you're going to get are isolated pop-up storm complexes. And when you get those, some people get really heavy rain. Nearby areas get nothing. And so we're going to go into this time period of just the pop-up garden variety summer thunderstorms on the heat and humidity of the day, rather than the storms that are forced along frontal boundaries or forced on these big troughs that sneak through. And that's going to change it up as we approach maybe the second and third weeks of of July. But back to your original point, I still don't think we lose the risk of the hot, stormy summer once we get to the end of July and into August.
So it seems like Beryl is that unexpected black swan event that came in and kind of upset the apple cart. It's going to kind of convolute the current regime of weather that has been wet in the Northwest, dry in the East, maybe mix that all up for a time. And at the same time, it also upset the marketplace. So if what you're saying is true, and we get more favorable weather throughout most of the Midwest, if the jet stream straighten out a little bit, that's going to make it kind of hard to talk much about a significant drought through the critical pollination and earfill period.
Yeah, the problem is going to be you're going to have pockets of drought showing up, right? There's going to be local or regional drought, and those growers are going to be staring at their fields, seeing yield being depleted, and they're going to look at the markets, which are not going to be reflecting that because other acres are getting rain. And the overall market position is just not set up today for a big bullish run toward anywhere that we'd like it to be. So honestly, you're calling this the black swan is right. This is actually not good. If we'd like to see a major price movement in the right direction, we would need more of a weather story on the downside. And to be honest, if most of the people listening to us are in the US, it'd be great if it was just somewhere else, right? And we've talked a lot about drought pressures in Ukraine. We've talked about the heat that's in Ukraine and in Western Russia. Still not seeing a market reaction out of that. There's been flooding earlier this spring south of the Yangtze River, drought that developed in and around Beijing, major ag area in and around Beijing, like the North China Plain, and I think it's called the Shandong province, which is just south of it. But now it's flooding rain in that area. And, that flip-flop hasn't really generated much of a reaction. There's been big monsoonal flow early in southern India, but the Ganges River Valley was dry, and now that flip-flopped. And so you look at all of these adverse weather events that have happened in major growing areas around the world, and it feels as though the markets just don't care. And right now they're saying, oh, it just rained because of Beryl, and the Northwest Corn Belt's been super wet, so that'll be fine. And we don't have massive drought pressure in major growing areas, so take the market down. And that's very frustrating and tricky. But I thought there'd be more of a weather premium already built into the system by now, but we didn't even have a spring rally. So this has been a very frustrating year. And I'll just tell you this, Marlin. Back in February, when I was traveling the country, every time I got a chance to talk to farmers in the Midwest that grow corn and soybeans, I asked the same question. I asked them to raise their hands. How many people in the audience want a big drought episode like 88 or 2012 or one of the really nasty years? And I'd count to 10 seconds in my head because no one would raise their hands in the first 10 seconds. But after about 20 seconds, a third of the hands would go up. Because to most of those growers, the bigger disaster would be $3.30 corn. If you got something that came in to upset the market and get things trading a different direction, they could capitalize on that with better marketing, strategies. And so it was interesting. They were saying, we need something to disrupt global grain supply. That was just an interesting thing to think about. A third of the growers would end up raising their hands by the time I waited for 30 seconds for them all to respond.
They just wanted it somewhere else.
That's right. I'm in Illinois. So what do we want? We want Indiana and Iowa to have problems. I'm going to Nebraska soon. They're going to want Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio and Iowa to all have problems. It's always put it on someone else's farm. And I get that. That's that makes a lot of sense.
I used to farm in Kansas, starting back in the late 70s. And I have to admit, we always had 3-eye envy because it seemed like they always had lots of moisture and we would burn up or hail out or something out there. Yeah, that's very true. So basically, we don't see any real calamitous problems anywhere in the globe right now, other than maybe a few issues in Russia and Ukraine. But that was mainly talking about wheat, and wheat is already pretty much harvested now.
Yeah.
There isn't much for the bulls to hang their hat on between now and the end of the year. If we're going to get a decent crop, even though the acreage may be down a little bit, we're still looking at really some big carryouts coming up here.
We are. But I'll say this. We started off talking about critical time periods, and I said pollination will extend probably into early August, given how much replant happened and how late some of the crop went in certain places because of too much rain back in April and May. I still think we've got another good scare because of heat and episodes of dry conditions, like a flash drought scenario that'll hit the Corn Belt before we finish July. And some of the longer range models continue to hint at a drier August, which could put a little bit of a scare into soybeans if we start depleting soil moisture. So I wouldn't say that we're away from a good weather push in the right direction, but it does seem as though that we're looking at a lower probability event than a higher probability event, given that it's July the 9th. We have a hurricane coming through. The Western Corn Belt is wet. The Eastern Corn Belt, parts of it are getting a drink. And I'm not predicting heat to come back in, like 90s to come back in until we get into this upcoming weekend and beyond. And low 90s, okay. Mid to upper 90s, problems. And I think that the highest temperatures stay way into the Western Plains. And much of the Corn Belt, we get into the 90s again, but I think it's going to pop. I think it's going to storm with all the heat and humidity. So you're right in saying, is there a high probability event that's coming up that could put pressure on the markets to the upside? And I don't see it right now.
Well, if there was ever a year that was a prime setup for a flash drought, and believe me, I've talked about that every year. I've been a farm broadcaster. This would be a prime candidate just because it was a wet spring in the western half of the belt. And I know from experience, those roots, when it's wet, they won't go down. And I've seen corn burn up standing in water before just because they didn't have a deep root system. And then it turns into instant heat. Like you say, like in late July or something, you get 100-degree temperatures with the wind behind it. And all of a sudden, the topsoil dries out and the roots, there's no way they can go down fast enough to catch up with the moisture. And you could have plenty of profile moisture there, and that crop will just burn up, just standing there above wet ground.
Yeah, I'd love to go. I have not been to Western Iowa, Northern Iowa, Southern Minnesota, parts of South Dakota this summer. And I'd like to get over there and just walk a field with a farmer and just pull a plant and have a look at that root structure for that one question. Because I'd like to know this as well. That what you just shared is kind of your wisdom and knowledge of farming for years, right? What I want to know is, have modern hybrids helped us battle against that risk, right? I'd like to talk to the guy that knows that new seed technology to know if the same stresses that you just mentioned could be as bad in 2024 should a flash drought scenario take over in late July or August, which is still a possibility given the setup. If it'll have the same kind of yield impacts as before, because my goodness, seed technology in the last 15 years seems to have outpaced some of the things that weather can throw at it.
Well, you're just a young buck, and I twice in my career I experienced, I think they call it striping on the ears.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you've ever seen it,
Yeah.
but it was a case where it got up into the hundreds as the corn was silking, and it would like kill the silks on the top where they were coming out of the end of the ear, and
Wow.
that would put a bare stripe on one side of the ear, and you instantly lost about 15% of your yield because you had bare ears on one side. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen.
Huh.
But that doesn't sound like that is going to be a threat at all this year.
Well, I don't think it's going to be a large threat, but there will be some local areas that could see those kind of dangerous temperatures at the wrong time. To be honest, I would think I think it's a management problem on the other side. We've already seen tar spot reported in Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, parts of Indiana. And where's that disease pressure going to go? And with Beryl coming up out of the south, we had seen southern rust reported in Louisiana and parts of Texas. Are we pushing that into this area? Which means now we're into July. What are we doing in terms of fungicide, right? I mean, that's another side of this that I think we're going to have to really start to scout for. Again, that's a little outside of my area of expertise, but I can look at maps and see where there's been reports and try to assess if it's a problem.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you about that. We were talking about the potential for problems with corn pollinating and stuff. Okay, soybeans are about a month behind, so their
Right.
critical time is August. So you were talking about the jet stream leveling out maybe by then. What does that mean for Midwest soybeans as we get into August?
Well, I think if there's risk of starting to get drier, it's going to show up in August. I think that the jet stream is about to go on a pretty far to the north retreat and stay there. And my reasoning for that is it's so warm in the North Atlantic off of like Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, that area. And then in the North Pacific, like in the Gulf of Alaska, it's been getting warmer and warmer. So if you just keep pushing the warmth north, the jet has to live north of that. And I just don't think it stays along the US-Canada border, but instead goes north of like Highway 16 and in the Canadian Prairie and even farther north than that. So what are you left with? You're left with isolated storms. We're left with humidity and isolated storms. And as a result, you're going to start to see bigger areas showing up, I think, with some drier conditions in August. But it comes back to the thing we just talked about a few minutes ago. Wild card. What if we get another Beryl? There's nothing. Beryl was B, right? We expect to go all the way through W this year. I mean, it's expected to be active. You get one of those to come up in August, and then it's done. I mean, one good solid rain in mid-August. Who cares if we can, what happened before and after? One big push, and those beans will take off. So I can't predict hurricanes months in advance. If I could, we wouldn't be talking today. You wouldn't even know who I am. I'd be some billionaire living on an island somewhere, But the reality is, we have to know that that's a potential threat for this year.
If we had Black Swan 2.0 that would come in out of the Gulf of Mexico, that could be all she wrote.
That's right. Yep.
As
And
far
that's
as
a
the markets
possibility.
go. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. Well, when you talk about that, if you do see a leveling out of the jet stream, a more what they call a zonal flow, going more horizontal across the U.S., like you say, that would tend to be more scattered showers. You kind of you don't have access to the Gulf moisture if that's the case. So that could be problematic in some areas, couldn't it?
It could, but we've been talking about a term lately that I typically reserve for hurricanes, and it's this term called the brown ocean. So what that term comes from is that you can often get a hurricane that goes over the southern tip of Florida. And normally when a hurricane makes landfall, it immediately weakens. There's friction, there's less access to moisture unless you hit the Everglades. And the Everglades are like a brown ocean. There's so much water to be evaporated, it works. Okay, why am I bringing that up? Well, right now in Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, parts of South Dakota, Nebraska, we've got a kind of partly brown ocean. There's so much water in that area that's in the vegetation and in the ground. Could it be recycled to help enhance any thunderstorms as we go a bit later? In other words, we just locally supply moisture, not just from the Gulf, which would mean that the zonal flow, even if it is farther to the north, wouldn't be missing the moisture component. We could still get the atmosphere to pop with storms. That's certainly something that happens. We do find in late summer recycling of local moisture is a big component to the thunderstorm activity. And by the way, it just popped in my head as I said this. We've been talking about all these potential stresses. One of the stresses that we haven't really discussed yet has been all the severe weather as well early this spring. I was just talking, in fact, having a conversation with some guys on Twitter that are in Nebraska, and they're just going on and on about how much damage has happened along and south of I-80 from severe weather, specifically hail, even since the end of June. And there's the potential. I mean, there might have been 500,000 acres lost of some of the prime farm ground in the country out there because of hail damage. So we say all of that in the same breath, but it's all thunderstorm related. And that's related to moisture, which kind of brings it back to your original question.
Yeah, I saw some pictures out of Iowa just a couple days ago
Yep.
where corn that had been about shoulder high was mowed down to about 8 inches tall. Well, that's not going to make anything. And I did hear of a lot of pivot irrigation systems rolled over in southern Nebraska. That's a bad time of year to lose your irrigation system, right when the corn is tasseling out. And if it rolled that many over, how are you going to replace them that fast? I mean, that puts all of
Oh,
those acres at risk because here they've already had plenty of water to get the plant going. And now that brings into that question, that flash drought scenario. If you can't put the water on them now when it gets hot, that could be a problem. So, yeah, I mean, there are isolated areas where it does look kind of dire moving into the end of July here.
yeah. It's just if we can get the markets to care about it, right? That's the ultimate question. But you bring up this idea of some of these pivots that were destroyed. I think it was 2 years ago in May of 2022, a derecho hit that part of Nebraska. It actually started in Kansas, finished in Minnesota, and it was the one that knocked over nearly, I think, all of the pivot irrigation in key areas in Nebraska. And we saw massive yield loss in that area because they couldn't water the crop. Now, they got it all repaired by the next year. I think it was 2022. It may have been 2021. But you're right. You can't just go out and fix your pivots the next day. It takes, you got to get all the supplies in, the people to fix it. And so, yes, there's going to be some issues in Nebraska after what had been a pretty wet and stormy start and looked pretty good. I think we've now knocked some of those acres back in that key producing state of Nebraska.
Yeah, I remember that that wiped out all the inventory that was on hand. They had to build them
Yeah.
just to create new pivots to replace them with. And I mean, that takes a lot of time to do something like
Yeah.
that. Well, okay. Where do you think we are in the growing season right now? Is there any chance that we could have a threat from an early frost this year?
Oh, great question. I was looking at this for some growers in northern Iowa that ended up planting. They told me the plant date May 21. So that's for those guys that are a month late in planting their corn. And if they told me they planted 105 day to 108 day corn, and that would mean that if planted on May 21st, historically they would reach black layer by about October 17. In northern Iowa, yeah, in northern Iowa, the first frost dates can sometimes happen in late September or the first couple of weeks of October, with the average first frost date at somewhere around the beginning of the second week of October, which means if they get an average year, they'll hit frost before black layer. Now, is this a risky year? Well, that comes back to something you asked me earlier. La Nina. If La Nina is a factor by fall, then we tend to actually have a warmer than average autumn on the, for the most part. But what's funny about the way fall works, and you know this, I know you know this, right, is that the jet stream in autumn becomes highly variable because you're in seasonal transition. And what can happen is you could have a really warm September, a really warm beginning of October, and then on October the 10th, A massive cold front comes through, dips a frost in, and then it gets really warm again for the rest of October. And it could be in the 50s all the way to December, but you got that one event that hit at the wrong time. So the whole 3-month stretch was warm, but that one day had the frost event. And that's what we're concerned about, is if anything early comes in, we're going to put a big section of the Northwest Corn Belt under the risk of having damage before the crop's finished.
Does that apply to soybeans too? I mean, there would be a lot of late soybean planting. Now, I know they're more daylight determinate, where a lot of times, if the days are getting shorter, they'll just stop growing. They may be short. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, but good point. So they were planted late as well in the Northwest corn and soybean belt. And then because of all the rain that was had in May and June and early July, we looked at solar insolation, so how much sunlight got to the ground, and it's off. They're in deficit, meaning that the crop has not gotten some of that early sunlight that it needed to, fill canopy, to grow big, to put on biomass, and to get ready for, its own reproductive stages. And so we expect the soybean crop in places, especially where we've not had much sunshine, to be late. And I'll be honest, I drove through parts of Wisconsin. This was also another area that's wet. They do grow a lot of beans in Wisconsin and corn. And this was just on Saturday, this past week. And there was some corn there that was not knee high yet, and beans that, they may have been a foot tall, nowhere close to closing canopy. And so that would be an area that's been too wet, too cloudy. And as a result, we've seen delays in the maturity of the crops. So there are vulnerabilities, a lot of vulnerabilities this year, and they're unique compared to the last several years. And but it comes back to something you said earlier. When is the market going to care about this? Is it going to be something that gives us a shock late when we're rolling harvesters through? I think that'll be a revealing time period once we get into October.
Well, and there's this ongoing debate about the planted acreage, and that'll go on forever. We probably won't get the answer to that until after the first of the year.
Yeah.
So I won't even go there. That's a whole different animal all to itself. Let's turn everything upside down. We're heading into harvest time here in about a month and a half, something like that. That means in the Southern Hemisphere, they're heading toward planting. Okay, if we're heading toward La Niña, typically, what does that mean for them then as they go into planting season?
Yeah, so first of all, some big news about planting season. Do you remember last year there were some Brazilian states that petitioned for an early plant date? It's supposed to be September 15, but they allowed them to start planting on September 1. I've heard that they've now got permission. I believe some of the big states like Mato Grosso are now allowed to plant on September 1. Now, they won't plant just because they can. They got to wait on the monsoonal rains to come in. They typically wait on about 2 inches of rain before they even let the planters go out, just to get the seed bed ready. But this is what I do know. Last year was an El Nino year, and much of the Cerrado was near record dry for September, October, November, and part of December. Like record dry. But it rained in January. And that's like raining in August for our soybeans. And they're being made big crop. It was not as big as it could have been, but the increase in acreage, which was 4%, somewhere in that vicinity, they still had big production, which means we didn't get the splash of that in our markets. So what about this year? Well, if it is truly a La Niña autumn for us, spring for them, the northern growing regions tend to be wetter earlier, which means their crop could get off to a really good start. But southern Brazil into Argentina tends to have the drier risk. But that all hinges on the strength of the La Niña. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think we're talking about a strong La Niña for this fall, their spring. Nope, I don't. I don't think it's going to be a strong one. I think it's going to be more on the weak side, or maybe even still ENSO neutral. At that point, because I have yet to see through this point in summer the trade winds to really pick up speed. The Southern Oscillation Index has not gone way, way, way positive. We've not seen the robbing of momentum from the westerlies in both hemispheres. So we're not getting the La Niña effects yet. It's going to have to make a major change in the next 60 days for me to change that narrative, and I just don't see it. By the way, the most aggressive forecast for La Niña is made by NOAA. Every other major forecasting center around the world, so like the Japanese, the French, the British, also the Australians, the Canadians, They're much slower in the progression of La Nina compared to NOAA. And I think that's going to be a critical piece to figure out as we get into their, into their growing season. But that September 1st plant date, if there's any early monsoonal rains, that would be devastating to our markets. They will go fast and they'll put in big acres.
Now, would that affect Argentina as well? If it's kind of a more of a neutral scenario?
Yeah. So if you remember 2 years ago, Argentina had record drought. That was a La Nina year. This year we had an El Nino and they did fine. They doubled up on their previous year's crop, which remember was cut in half. Do they go back into drought stress? I think they do. I think they go back into potential for drought stress if the La Nina plays according to its typical features and hits them with weaker flow and more problematic conditions with respect to early drought development.
Well, I don't want to leave out the wheat farmers. What if that is a scenario? What does that mean for wheat production in places like Australia?
Sure. So the Australians, as they transition over, normally if you talk to an Australian grower, they love La Nina. I mean, it's the best thing ever. It rains, they've got the moisture, and they're in pretty good shape. They don't like El Nino. Here's what was interesting. This previous El Nino did not produce the normal conditions. They actually got rains at key times in parts of Australia. And now, as we're transitioning to neutral, we've seen drought develop in Western Australia, deep drought in Western Australia, South Australia, which is around Adelaide, extremely dry. New South Wales and Victoria, also dry. And even pockets of Queensland have been pretty dry. Lately, now remember, they're in early winter right now. They've had some moisture that's gotten in to hit their winter crops, and they grow a lot of winter crops, including wheat. But you'll talk to most of them, and they'll say, we need more. We've got to have more. In fact, I'm going to have a conversation with a large group of them tomorrow to kind of talk through a few things and look at the longer-term projections. But normally, you'd have a lot of smiles on growers' faces if we said good, strong La Nina coming in, because that would mean good spring rains to finish their winter crops.
About here in the U.S., do you think we'll have a decent fall for wheat?
If I took the models at face value, it looks drier into fall in the in the central plains of the United States. If we think back to what came out this year, it was super dry in April, then massive storms in May, in Kansas, where you, of course, have been doing some farming. The Kansas drought. In fact, I had a guy, no joke, he updated me every day with how many days it had been in his part of south central Kansas since he'd had a 2-inch rain. And he was up over like 700 days before it finally rained in his area, more than 2 inches. And once it started, he got some good moisture and he was pretty happy about it. But I would just say that the southern plains of the United States and the central plains, because of their proximity to the Rocky Mountains, we're always very sensitive to drought issues. So what will the moisture look like in that area as we get into fall? Models at face value are drier right now.
Interesting stuff. Eric, I can't thank you enough for joining us to talk about the outlook here and how things are set up as we get into the last half of the growing season. I appreciate that so much. Hopefully I'll get to talk with you again and do a follow-up. This is great stuff. And hopefully everybody gets the weather they need as we move forward in the growing season here of 2024. That is Eric Snodgrass of Nutrien Ag Solutions. He's their senior science fellow there. Love to say that. And that'll do it for this particular episode. Thanks again for joining us. As always, make sure you share this video with others and subscribe to the bell icon down below. And like these videos as well. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Thanks for joining us on our Comstock YouTube channel. Don't forget you can also find us on Facebook and TikTok as well. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.